Knowledge and information. This is the theme of this year's edition of Global Access. The importance of knowledge has been evident to man since the beginning of time. But the information society presents new questions. How does the increasingly intense flow of information affect our ability to maintain a holistic understanding of the world? And does it actually make us smarter or dumber? Andrew Keen is a writer and an entrepreneur in information technology. He warns of the devastating effects of the digital revolution, coming in the shape of economic inequality, unemployment, and a business that is monitoring us as consumers. Here in conversation with Thomas Gehr.
Internet is not the answer, but what was the question?
The question is, what should the operating system be for our network 21st century?
And why is the internet not the answer?
The internet's not currently the answer because it's caused or compounding four big problems: economic and cultural inequality, long-term threat of unemployment, cultural decay and chaos, and finally what I call surveillance capitalism. That book, The Internet Not the Answer, was published in 2015. Sounds a bit archaic now. I'm not very keen on the word the internet. No. So when we say, you ask what's the question, what should be the correct operating system? The internet is a word we use to describe this new technological world, not only of what everyone understands now as the internet and mobile technology, but AI, virtual reality, blockchain, and all these other disruptive technologies.
And I think the key term is that this is a disruptive technology. And what signifies disruptive technologies? Where they create chaos, they create new type of fortunes, and they upwheel the old systems, I think.
Yeah, it's more than just creating fortunes. It's disrupting everything we take for granted about how we work, how we identify ourselves, how we organize politically and economically, how we define ourselves in cultural terms, how we articulate who we are. These are very profound changes. What's going on today in the early part of the 21st century is disruptive and chaotic and exciting and challenging as what happened in the middle of the 19th century with the Industrial Revolution. It's as profound a change. Some people call it the Fourth Industrial Age. Some people call it the Second Industrial Revolution. There are all sorts of terms to describe it. I don't have a particular term myself, but whatever words you use, it's a big, big deal.
Mm-hmm. And there are some, I think, traits or characteristics of it that are fairly special. One, I think, was also one of the first books you wrote, is that amateurism, in a way, is replacing experts. And we thought that would be positive initially, didn't we?
We? Well, who are you talking about?
Well, the general opinion or opinion leaders. It would lead to new type of knowledge distribution. It would lead to participation. It would lead to
blah blah blah.
Yeah.
Well, Thomas, you know the general opinion is always wrong. In the beginning of the 2000s, the turn of the new century, with this thing in Silicon Valley that's called Web 2.0, people said, well, we can democratize the culture. We do away with experts, guys like yourself and perhaps myself. Everyone will have a voice. It will democratize the culture. It will do away with elites. It will enrich the culture, and of course the reverse has happened. I wrote an early book about this, warning about the dangers, in 2007, called Cult of the Amateur. When I wrote that book, I was accused of being an elitist and out of touch and not understanding everything. I was anything but out of touch. I'm a Silicon Valley entrepreneur. Today, in 2018, with Trump and Brexit and Putin's trolls doing enormous damage to Western democracy, most people are coming to me and saying, oh, maybe in 2007 you were right. We didn't think you were, but now we acknowledge it. So now the zeitgeist has shifted. It's becoming increasingly clear that the democratization of culture actually is not in any way good for democracy, has undermined democracy and empowered the mob and trolls and nasty dictators like Vladimir Putin.
And then we have also the a fairly new phenomenon of that what I would call theft of content, that it's much easier to...
Sorry, what of content?
Theft of content.
Theft of content. Well, there's a bigger problem. It was a bigger problem. I'm less worried about that today. I think people always steal content. People always steal stuff. I think that the biggest problem with the theft of content was with Napster in the last gasps of the 20th century, when there was this wholesale ransacking of the music business. It resulted in a 50% drop in the sale of recorded music. But the music business now is coming back with paid streaming services like your own Swedish Spotify. So I'm less worried about stealing than I am about cultural decay.
And cultural decay also, in a way, goes hand in hand with an extreme narcissism that has been promoted by what we call social media in general, I guess.
Yeah, well, you call it social media, I call it anti-social media. In 2012, I wrote a book called Digital Vertigo, which basically argued that social media was anti-social. What it does is actually personalize media, turns media into a mirror. So we join these networks, not out of any social reasons, but to glorify ourselves, to make ourselves seem more important, more central in the universe. And it seems with social media that the world revolves around us. And of course, the result of that is an increasing narcissism. Now, narcissism isn't caused by the internet. The ancient Greeks, of course, came up with the concept of narcissism. And it's certainly not only a modern or postmodern phenomenon. But it seems to be compounded by the digital revolution. It seems to isolate us, turn us into ourselves, make us lonely and more atomized. And people always used to talk about Barack Obama as the first internet president because he liked being online and because his marketing was good. But that's entirely wrong. The first internet president is Donald Trump because he's an extreme narcissist. And he hasn't exploited the technology in the sense that he's some sort of Machiavellian figure who's trying to deceive people. The technology comes naturally to him as an extreme narcissist who only sees the world through his own lens and who has no ideology apart from that of Donald Trump. This social media, this so-called social media technology, is perfect for him. And the electorate has also fallen into what we might call the narcissism trap. So Trump is the first real internet president, or if you like, the first internet narcissist president, and it's certainly compounding our culture of narcissism.
And then we have the economic impact of the new technology with very large monopolies where, in a way, a winner takes all economy also for them, I guess. Is that a problem in a sense of...
Well, it's not a problem if you're one of the winners. You're a tech guy, right? You're an IT guy. You look as if you've done well. You can at least afford a tie. I can't even afford a tie as a loser in Silicon Valley.
It was a gift.
It was?
It's from a politician.
Well, I don't know if you should acknowledge that publicly. We were promised the internet would democratize opportunity, create more jobs, more startup entrepreneurs, more companies, and there would be a flowering of innovation. And in some senses, that's true. But of course, the real result is a winner-take-all economy where you only have one winner in social, Facebook, one winner in search, Google, one winner in online video, YouTube, one winner in e-commerce, Amazon. And the problem is these companies, they're not bad companies, they're brilliantly run, they're remarkably innovative in technological terms. Amazon is perpetually innovating. But they're crushing any kind of opposition. If you want to get into e-commerce, you're doomed. If you want to get into search, you're doomed. If you want to start a new social network, you're doomed. And these companies either crush opposition or buy them. So it's not a great age for innovation. We're back in the late 90s when Microsoft dominated everything. And that's why, of course, we need antitrust regulation. We need politicians in particular to flatten the playing field. For my last book, How to Fix the Future, I spent some time with Margrethe Vestager, the EU Commissioner of Competition. And as she told me, her job is flattening the playing field to enable everyone to play. At the moment, only a tiny group of people can actually play the game. Mm-hmm.
But as you mentioned earlier in the start, that this is not the first time that we have a disruptive technology.
No, absolutely not.
With the Industrial Revolution, especially from the 18th century in Great Britain, there were some remedies and reforms in order to deal with the worst parts of it. I mean, we don't send young boys down to chimneys or into mines anymore.
I hope not. Well, you certainly don't in Sweden. Absolutely, we can, as you're suggesting, we can learn from history. Sometimes, particularly these sort of people without any memory in Silicon Valley say, it's the first time we've ever had these technologies. Of course, the first time we've had AI, the first time we've had a global network of like the internet, but it's not the first time that you've had massive disruption. It's not the first time you've had monopolies. It's not the first time we've had a profound problem with joblessness or inequality or cultural chaos. As you say, in the middle of the 19th century, kids were sent down chimneys. We had an enormous seething underclass of underemployed or unemployed workers and a tiny group of incredibly rich, what Marx called bourgeoisie. We had massive environmental destruction. We still do in some ways, but it was more immediate in the middle of the 19th century. We had inability for people to actually talk to one another. Marx wrote about this very famously in the Communist Manifesto, written in 1848, which is a particularly important year in the Industrial Revolution. And in some ways, we've solved those issues, not through revolution, but through reform. The Scandinavian model of creating a social security net has been extremely important.
But you also have in Britain the British anti-mining laws, which came actually approximately the same years as the manifestos were written.
Right, and it's not even a leftist thing. It's not as if I'm calling for some, in America, anytime you call for any kind of state response to anything, you're accused of being a socialist. But actually, the most important social reform of the last part of the 19th century was Bismarck, who was anything but a socialist, anything but a leftist. He understood that there was a need to create social security net to avoid revolution. And some conservative politicians are beginning to realize that now in terms of, say, the discussion about guaranteed minimum income as AI undermines more and more people's jobs. So absolutely. So we can learn from history. In my book, my last book, How to Fix the Future.
That was also my question.
Highly historical. I go back to the 19th century. I say we can learn from this. We can learn about the history of the food industry, or in the 20th century, the history of the automotive industry. And we need to learn from the past in order to fix the future.
Yeah. Because how do we fix the future? I think you have an answer on 5 general points. It's regulation, competition, innovation, education, consumer power, and citizen engagement. So
but
what
there's
type
a meta level too.
Yes.
The meta level is agency. Human agency.
Yes.
And that's the real call to action in the book, is to remind people that we actually control our fate and that we need to seize this opportunity and shape this technological revolution before it shapes us. So the meta level is agency, and then the 5 tools, if you like, that you mentioned.
Let's start with agency. I guess we don't have it today. Who are we in this sense? I guess you and I have it.
Well, we have it. I think people do have it. I think more and more people are concerned about all this change around them. They don't really get it. But of course, for the people watching this, I can't look at them, but if they can see us, that's the nature of surveillance capitalism, of course. They're watching everything. People are worried. They don't understand all these forces around them. They're worried that their children won't have jobs. They're worried about these huge companies that control all our data and look at us all the time, watching us, turning us into product. They're worried that they're worried about AI, this big transformative thing that will replace them at work. They're worried about virtual reality and what that will mean in terms of addiction. They're worried most of all about their kids. They see their kids glued to their I don't have my phone with me, but most kids and grown-ups are spending more and more time tied to their smartphones, these supercomputer machines that now fit into our pocket and soon will be embedded in our hands or our eyes. So people get in. There's 2 responses to it. Either there's nothing we can do, these forces are too big, we're just going to get on with our lives. and then you lose, or we lose collectively as a species, or we say we can change stuff. It doesn't mean that we can go and break up. I mean, Margaret Vestager can break up Amazon or Apple. She can fine Apple. She did $12 billion. She can launch an antitrust investigation of Google. But most of us can do something as teachers, as parents, as consumers, as innovators. We can come up with new ideas for companies. We can elect politicians committed to changing this world. We can try to control our children's addiction. We can, as consumers, demand better products. So we're not going to put up with this. So we can all do something. And when we say we can't, we lose. So that's the key thing. It's agency.
And do you think that we will be able to?
I hope so. Again, it's not. I can. I hope you can. I hope our audience can. We've always done it in the past. We're good at two things, our species. We're good at breaking things and fixing them. So we're good at breaking the future and then fixing it. We've always done it in the past, and I think we'll do it in the future. There is no end of history, and there is no perfect fix. There's no app to fix the future. Some may come on this show and say, oh, blockchain's the answer. All we need is blockchain. That's transparent. That's the new internet. But that's a mistake. 20 years ago, people said, the internet will fix the future. Technology doesn't. We as humans do. And I'm hopeful, absolutely. I don't seem very cheerful, but I am.
But let's start with these 5 other, the lower level, under the meta level of your suggestions. What type of regulations are we talking about?
I think Europeans are leading.
Laws or...
I think antitrust investigation, breaking up these companies, perhaps certainly weakening them is important, enabling more competition. I think data laws about protecting our data, making sure that we aren't the product. The GDPR in Europe is a good beginning. I think the German attempt to treat Facebook as a media company and make them accountable for the illegal and often distasteful stuff that's published on these platforms. So those are 3 good beginnings. I think we need government. If we don't have government, we've got nothing. That's our protection. That's what we have. The market doesn't work on its own. It's always the Silicon Valley way to say, leave us alone, everything will work out in the end. The market forces will result in an abundance of data and democracy and opportunity, and that's not the case. When you just leave the market alone, you have monopolies, you have a winner-take-all economy, you have surveillance capitalism. So that's the point where the government has to step in. And in America, the government is dysfunctional. Historically, it's always been weak and distant, but it's particularly dysfunctional today for unique American reasons. So that's why the Europeans need to lead, and they are leading. It's very encouraging.
But the track record of government intervention is not too good either.
What do you mean?
Well...
Spoken as a Swede? What do you...
I'm of Turkish descent, and I know very much what government intervention means. No, but also the Swedish track record, for example, of government intervention is not always the best either. We have had, for example, we have had a government intervention on the housing market since 1942, for example, and then we have the housing situation let's not talk about housing, but how do we secure that the government intervention is beneficial in that manner?
Well, you can never know for sure. And
I guess you have the agency for that too.
Well, yeah, you have to know when to stop. I'm certainly not calling for some Stalinist solution to this, a top-down destruction of innovation. The 5 tools need to work together. I describe them in my book as a kind of stack. So I'm not just calling for regulation, and I'm not calling for sort of indiscriminate regulation, but we need to start with some element of regulation. So, for example, the GDPR is an interesting way of trying to protect consumers' data. It's had some criticisms, maybe it won't work perfectly, but what I hope it will do is stimulate innovation with entrepreneurs, allowing new opportunities, new social networks, new business models, new search engines, new lockers, new services for consumers. So I don't think we can think of regulation in its own, just isolated from the other 4 principles. I think they need to go together. And the best kind of regulation stimulates innovation, like new data laws that will enable new entrepreneurs, like forcing Facebook to become accountable under the law, which can stimulate traditional media, because suddenly, again, you have a flatter playing field where everyone's playing according to the same rules. So I don't want to fall into the trap of saying, well, the only solution is regulation. That would be an error and also an inaccurate description of my own position.
But I guess then innovation and regulation, which we spoke about, has to go hand in hand with all the other three elements you mentioned. But what type of education do we need, or what type of changes in our way of educating young people do we have to implement?
Education is the longest term, it's the biggest challenge, it's the one I always leave to the end, it's the one that people always say, well, we need a new education system, and often when people say that, it means they have no idea of how to solve the problem. In my book, I describe some alternative education systems like the Waldorf system or the Montessori system, which tries to focus on, quote unquote, the human in us. I think what the education system needs to do is focus on the areas that we can beat the algorithm. We've invented these algorithms that replicate us and replace us in many ways. They'll drive our cars, they'll do our arithmetic. They'll be our lawyers and engineers, but they can't do this. You can't have an algorithm in this kind of interactive, spontaneous conversation. Ever, I don't think. You can't have algorithms that are empathetic. You can have an algorithm that can figure out why someone's sick, but you can't have an algorithm to sit down with a patient and talk to them about what the illness is and how you need to deal with it. So I think we need an education system that focuses on the human, on the creative, on the empathetic. Algorithms, and this was said by Ada Lovelace in the middle of the 19th century, Ada Lovelace being the inventor of software, the daughter of Lord Byron, the most brilliant figure perhaps in the history of computing, a self-taught mathematician, very romantic figure. She said in the middle of the 19th century, algorithms can't think for themselves. No. And so our education system needs to focus on the areas that the algorithm can't go, thinking for itself, having goals, those human areas that will enable us to compete and flourish in the age of the algorithm. It's a hugely important issue. If we maintain our top-down education system where people are expected to learn things off by heart, there's no reason to learn anything off by heart. We have Google now. Google is our collective memory. It's not ideal. There are a lot of problems with that. But let's focus on the things that Google can't do.
From a very practical point of view, because I think that's the question is always asked, what does it mean for, when should young children, for example, very young children be introduced to the internet, to computers, to algorithms, and by heart learning, you said we have Google, but isn't it a question of being able to quote poetry by heart? Still a human... in a way.
Yeah, I'm not necessarily convinced that quoting poetry by heart is valuable unless you particularly like the poetry. But it's nice to have. I don't have a very good memory. I've never been able to learn anything by heart. So I like having Google so I can remind myself of the poetry. But your question is an important one. When should young children be introduced to these devices? It's one that parents will often confront. I don't think there are any hard and fast laws. You can't say, well, at 3 or 4 or 5. But just as parents are responsible in terms of how their children eat, how much television they watch, how many fizzy drinks they have, how much exercise they get, so they need to think of the internet in terms of social health. That means that children shouldn't be spending 16 hours a day on their devices, tied to their devices, not going out, not playing, not reading books. But every parent knows the balance. I'm not going to tell people what they should or shouldn't be doing. I certainly don't believe in regulation in that area, that children shouldn't be allowed to use these devices. But a responsible parent doesn't allow their child to eat in Burger King or McDonald's every day. The problem, of course, is that this revolution, again, compounds all the traditional inequalities of modern life because the responsible parent, the responsible family tends to be well off. And ultimately, the casualties of this digital revolution are the underclass, our poor kids, our kids with parents who work 3 or 4 jobs or single-parent homes. That they're the ones who are going to be addicted to this because they don't have guidance. So it needs to come from schools as well. And even the state has a role, I think, to play in this. As the state has a role in trying to encourage people to eat well, not to take hard drugs, not to drink alcohol, not to gamble. It's the same issue. It's increasingly being found that this stuff is addictive. What we need to do is make it illegal, I think, or put pressure on these Silicon Valley companies when they are explicitly designing products that are designed to be illegal. And Silicon Valley is beginning to wake up. You have a reform movement there where people are calling on designers to be more ethical and even sign some sort of code saying that they won't design products that are created in order to get people addicted to them.
I guess to sum up, in a way, we will end up in your last two points in this reform agenda, and that is consumer power and the last one, citizen engagement. You need to have engaged citizens, which I guess takes us back to agency.
Agency is everything, and I even have, we're summing up here, I have a cute term to sum up. Most of these books on technology talks about something called Moore's Law, Gordon Moore's Law, the co-founder of Intel.
The double O.
Moore, who talked about the processing power doubling every 18 months. That's the engine, the motor of the digital revolution. It's neither good nor bad, it's just a scientific truth. I invent my own Moore's Law, but it's M-O-R-E.
Thomas More.
Thomas More, the author of Utopia, 16th century masterpiece about agency. And I remind everyone, again, it comes back to history, that this isn't new, that More was writing at a time against Luther, good, and I know he's not Swedish, but certainly had a big impact on Swedish society. The idea of predestination, the notion that there is no such thing as human agency, was as anti-humanist then, 500 years ago, as it is today. Today we have people like Kevin Kelly in Silicon Valley writing books called The Inevitable, which is another form of predestination. And you have humanists like myself saying, hold on a minute, we have power, and I call this Moore's Law. We have a responsibility to make the world a better place as citizens, as parents, as voters. And so I think the fourth issue of citizen engagement, which I call Moore's Law, is what makes us human. And it's particularly important because it will enable us to remain human in the age of the algorithm.
It's a bit like the end of Terminator 2, that the future is not written, but it's written by us.
Well, the future, I hope the future will be written by us, because if it isn't, then we won't be here in 100 years, you and I.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.